you guys doing? You look good. You look good. Yeah, are you ready for this? Now, some of you are like, I don't know. I'm so excited. I'm excited for next week to go to the park and have our service there. We are going to rock that amphitheater. It is going to be so much fun. Come hungry and excited for that. I'm also excited because the week after, when we come back, we are going to unveil the Oasis. We went through the big capital campaign and got all that together. Oasis, our secondary space, our secondary worship space where our Saturday night service happens and all of our training, everything. That whole room has been changed from top to bottom. So the cafe will be back open. You can get your sugar high in the morning, and we will put the caffeine in you down there, and it'll be open the week that we get back. So we're 2 weeks out from that. So that's like 2 good weeks in a row, like amazing stuff happening. So we're excited for all that. We are in the middle of a series called This Was Your Idea. And guess what? This was your idea. That's what this is all about. On Easter, we asked you guys for questions, to ask us things. What are things that you want to know, that you would like to see preached about on a Sunday morning? And so it's really great because we wanted to hear your feedback. And it's really great because if it's not good, it's your fault. Right? Okay? And so this week, we're going to cover a new topic, something different. I didn't know if you caught that in the video, but I want to read you some of the questions we got submitted. One of them is, why can't anything good happen to me? The next one is, does Murphy's Law only apply to me? Ever felt that way? How come it all keeps falling apart? If it can, it falls apart for me. Why does everyone else have it better than me? Related to that, is there more to this life? And then finally, how do I find faith and hope? Which certainly you're going to need to navigate that first block, right? And in case this sounds, maybe some of those to you, you heard it, and first you said it sounds a little bit whiny maybe. How come everybody's got it better than me? How come all that kind of stuff? Let me tell you something. This is something that every single person has to go through. Every single Christian has to go through these periods of time. Nobody is immune to this sort of thing, and I'll tell you how you can know. When something bad happens, what are the first questions that every single person asks? We all say the same thing. What did I do to deserve this? That's one of them, right? Come on, I'm doing the same thing over and over again. I did my devotion this morning. How come everything that I've touched all day long is falling apart? Why is this? And the second thing, if you're a believer, you're like, God, where are you at? You're like, everything's falling apart. You're like, Jesus, hello, what's going on? How come you're not here right now? I don't understand why all of these things are falling apart. And for me, these sorts of things tend to happen in blocks. They tend to happen in chunks. I'll be going along and everything's going well, and then all of a sudden everything falls apart. I went through a period of time where I had a family member who was going to move into my building. They're struggling with addiction and stuff, and there's had to be like some boundaries. For some reason, they wanted to move into my building. Can you imagine what that's like? It's like, oh man, no way. The same day, I took my car to the shop. My radio was going all funky. It's like it was demon possessed. It just kept coming on and off and on and like loud and soft and all these like weird things happening. I took it down there. They went to get it fixed. $1,000 for a radio. How come everything at the mechanic cost $1,000? It's like they have a whole manual in the back and they look through this entire list of things that can go wrong and it all just says equals $1,000. $1,000, it's like you drop it off. Guess what? It's $1,000, it's like it goes through. On top of that, I was in a busy season of ministry. There were a lot of things that were going on here at the church. And I got to tell you, that's the first thing I was like, these things are happening, like stuff's like going wrong. I'm like, God, what are you doing? I'm in a busy season. All these things are going on. What's going on, man? What am I experiencing? Every single person would do this. And underneath that whole thing is the idea, shouldn't it be better than this? Shouldn't it be a little bit easier than this? I'm doing the right things. I'm trying to say yes to Jesus, all of that. Shouldn't it be a little bit easier than it is now? How come it's so hard? And it makes sense to think that way because the story of Jesus is the redemption of the world from sin. That's the story of Jesus. The way that the story reads in the garden, we chose to do the very thing that God said not to do. That's the story of humanity. God said, don't do this. We decided to do this. And because of that, sin has entered into the world. Everything that's broken, everything that falls apart, all of the difficulty of life is because of that moment. And when we read the story, it makes sense then that the first 3 stories that happen after the garden are all bad things. Brother kills brother, and the world is filled with wickedness and has to kind of get started over. And then we build a tower, the Tower of Babel. We tend to build a tower into the sky so that we can be God ourselves. Why would the author of Genesis give us 3 stories that are kind of bad in a row? I'll tell you why. He's like, this is the way that the world is now. Because of sin, because of the decisions in the garden, the world is filled with all of these bad sorts of things. We now live in the sort of place where brother would want to kill brother, where people decide to be wicked, where people make the sorts of decisions that they want to be God themselves. They don't let God be God, but will be God ourselves. After that, when you continue to read through the scriptures, you read through this period of time where God doesn't just sit idly by, but decides to select a people and to train them on what it would look like to live in a godly way. And so he gives them commandments. He gives them things that they are to do. And by doing these things, they're demonstrating the character of God. They're demonstrating who he is. So when they decided to not lie, because God said, don't lie, that's because God doesn't lie. And when they followed that, they would be closer and closer and closer to the kind of person that God is. There's one trouble with that. We're not very good at following the rules. We like to break the rules along the way. And so God had a solution to that. He sent Jesus. And when Jesus came here, Jesus decided he came here, he lived a life that was perfect. Jesus did everything right, said everything right, and decided to go to the cross to trade his life for ours. This is the best deal ever. Jesus said, I'll take on all the sin, all the ugliness, all the broken dreams, everything that this world can offer, past, present, and future. Jesus said, I will take that onto myself and trade you my perfection instead. Wow, what a deal that is. And by doing that, Jesus redeemed everything. He paid for the debt that sin causes. All of that, all the guilt, all the shame, everything, Jesus paid for that. And so, when Jesus did that, when the early hearers, these Israelites that knew the story, they knew how sin entered into the world, they knew the commandments that God had given, and they even knew how difficult it was to follow those. They knew that they couldn't do it on their own. When they heard that Jesus paid for sin and reversed the fortune of the world, this was good news, and the story of Jesus spread like wildfire throughout the nation. Every town, every city that it went by, people were believing in the name of Jesus as soon as they were told this is the best news they had ever heard. There's one problem with that. They woke up the next day and the next day and the next day, and they looked out into the world, and they still saw the effects of sin. They looked out and they went home, they turned on the ancient news, if you will, and they still saw stories of brother killing brother. And they still saw stories of people doing wicked things. And they still saw stories of people deciding to be God themselves instead of God being God. They saw all those things and they began to be disillusioned. Wait a minute, I thought Jesus was going to change the fortune of the world. I thought all the sin was paid for and the king was here now and Jesus is in charge of everything. I thought that all of these things were going to change. And so what they began to do is they began to turn back to their old belief systems. Some of them were like, listen, if nothing's going to change, then I'm just going to go back to the way that I was brought up. And some of them were even walking away from the faith because of these things. And so the author of Hebrews writes his letter to those people. He writes it to those who are disillusioned, to those who are having trouble dealing with what's going on in the world and in their personal lives. And this is what he says. In Hebrews 2:8, he kind of sets up the problem. He says, you have put all things into subjection under his feet. Now, this is talking about Jesus. God has put everything under the subjection, under the rule, the reign, the authority of Jesus. In case we missed that, he says it again, for in subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subject to him. That means that no matter where you go, if you're walking down the street, you could ask the question, is this under the subjection of Jesus? And then you would go, yes. And then you go to the next street, is this under the subjection of Jesus? You would say yes. You could go to the next nation, is this under the subjection of Jesus? You would say yes. Jesus' authority is everywhere. There is nothing anywhere that is not under the subjection of Jesus. Is that enough double negatives for you? But now, this is what he says after that. But now, we do not yet see all things subjected to him. Boom. This was the main problem. But now we look out and not everything seems to be under the authority of Jesus. Doesn't take us long to figure that out, right? We turn on our news today. We would think after 2,000 years, we would at least be a little bit better, right? But even today on our news, what's it filled with? Brother killing brother. All kinds of wickedness in the world. People making decision to be God instead of letting God be God. It's the same stories 2,000 years later. And so this is what we see. Even though Jesus is the CEO of the earth, he's the king, the reigning chief executive officer of planet Earth, everything is under subjection. The author of Hebrews is even saying the sin still remains. It's still here. It's still around us. All of our best laid plans still seem to fall apart. And this makes us ask different questions at different levels. At the universal level, we'll look out into the world and we'll ask perhaps the more philosophical questions. We'll ask questions like, well, wait a second though. If God is God, then why is there even evil at all then? Why doesn't he just do away with that? Why doesn't God just stop evil? Like right now, I'd be like, no more evil. Or on a world level, we'll ask ourselves things like, why does God allow natural disasters? Why does he allow earthquakes and hurricanes? Why doesn't when a hurricane forms in the Caribbean, why doesn't God just look at that and just like, no? And then all of a sudden it just, poof, it's gone, you know? Or on the national level, that's back to our news. You know, we'll see all these problems that keep poking up everywhere and different stories and different things. And we'll be like, why doesn't God just do something about that? And why doesn't he just fix it? Or on the personal level, this is where the questions were. We ask questions then like, why is life just so difficult? How come I keep trying to do the right things and the wrong things just seem to happen? How come I go through these seasons and it seems so unbearable just to get by? It's the same problem on all the different levels. And the trouble with all this is that it has the potential to distort our view of Jesus. Left untreated, what will happen is we'll start to think things that are honest. It is honest to think them, but they're thoughts that we don't want to think. And so oftentimes we'll think something, we'll be like, well, maybe just God doesn't seem smart enough. So maybe he's looking out, and he has that God perspective on things, but maybe this is a problem that can't be solved. Maybe not even with God's intellect, he can figure out how to get rid of these things. Or we'll ask the question, we'll think the thought, God doesn't seem powerful enough. So maybe God knows what he should do, but he just doesn't have the power to be able to do it. Maybe nothing has the power to be able to turn around the fortune of the world. God doesn't seem like he cares enough. This is probably the most common one. Maybe we're in tune. We believe that God must be infinitely smart and God must be infinitely powerful, but maybe for some reason he just doesn't care. That's another way of even saying, I don't even know if God is good or not. Questioning God's goodness in that sense. C.S. Lewis writes about this, and he sets it up in a book that's entitled The Problem of Pain. He sets up the problem. He says, if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power or both. That's a pretty square statement, isn't it? But that's the problem. we go through that time, and on whatever level we're thinking about it, or if it's just going on in our personal lives, that's the question we ask. We say, God, where are you? What's the problem, God? Are you lacking goodness? Are you lacking power? Are you lacking both? I don't understand why you're not doing something about this situation. And in case just for a second you think, well, I would never ask those questions. I would never doubt God's intelligence, or I would never doubt God's power. I would never doubt that God cares or not. 3 weeks ago, I'm in the middle of the Oasis project. I got all kinds of things going on, and there are challenges to be overcome, and I got contractors on the way, and we've got a lift in the room to get up into the ceiling. The ceiling's so tall in there, and I stopped by Stan's house, and I needed to pick up plywood so that we could drive the lift on the plywood and just protect the floor and, do all the stuff in there. Because let me tell you guys, that room looks so good, okay? And so we're protecting it to go along. And I show up at his house super early. I got people that are showing up to do all kinds of work in there. I need to be back up there to be able to tell them what we're going to do today and what our goals are for the day and all those sorts of things. And I'm in his shed, and he's helping me. We're getting down this plywood, and it's been up there for a long time. And so we're taking this plywood down. It's got like an inch of topsoil on it, so it's kind of dumping in my face along the way. I'm kind of breathing it and just kind of spitting it out, and the whole thing. If you ever unloaded something like that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I carry it over. I'm strapping it down on top of my little teeny tiny RAV4, and I'm putting it in the back, and I got this thing loaded down full of plywood. And Stan's been helping me. He comes around the corner, and he says, "Hey, John." I'm like, "Yeah, man. We're sweating. It's hot. It's been so hot here lately. We're sweating." He comes around. He's like, "You have a flat tire." I come around the corner, and I look at it, and I got to tell you, on the inside, I'm wanting to chain together cuss words. I'm wanting, one's not good enough. I'm wanting to start with a syllable from this one and insert a syllable from that one. I'm inventing cuss words. I am not even kidding you. But Stan is standing right there, Senior pastor of the church. On the inside, I'm like, oh, wow. Isn't that a pickle? Gosh, golly gee, wouldn't have thought that, there's a big old sheet metal screw sticking out of this tire, and I'm like, oh no. And so I go to the glove compartment box, and I open it up, and I pull out the instruction manual, and I'm flipping through it, and I never had a flat tire on this thing before, and so I find where the tire jack is, and so I find that. Took me a second even to get that out, and I got it out, I put it on the ground. I turn to the next page in the instruction manual, and it shows having a tire iron. But there's no tire iron in the car. I've got a jack that I can't jack, okay? And so I don't know who at Toyota sat down and was like, here's what we'll do. We'll give them the jack, but nothing to jack it with. Oh, we're going to save 50 cents a car or whatever. I'd like to slap that guy in the mouth, okay? And so I get down to the auto parts place, and I buy this universal jack thing that's got all the different sizes. I don't know what size my lug nuts are on my car. I'm not the most mechanically adept kind of guy. I get back there, and I set the jack thing on the ground. I sit on the ground. It's one of those four-way, like T-bar kind of things to go on there. And I start to jack up the car, but I realize that because it has the bars going in four directions, I can only get it an eighth turn until I hit the ground, and then I have to take it off and put it back on, and an eighth turn. I spend like 35 minutes turning this little jack thing, pulling it off, sticking it back on. The sun is baking me, okay? Listen, all right? I burn, I don't tan, okay? And it's like, I'm standing out there, I'm sweating. In the middle of it, I'm like, God, what are you doing? I have people that are waiting for me on your project. Every single step of the way. I don't own this room. This is your room. Every single step of the way, you've shown us this is what you want us to do. And I'm changing my tire outside. You couldn't have prevented the screw. You couldn't have even gone back in time and just told that little guy at Toyota, put the tire jack in the car. Nothing, God. I'm sitting here doing it. None of us are me. I'm one of your pastors. And I'm like questioning everything, okay? None of us are immune to these things. And what's so important is that the author of Hebrews wants to teach us what to do with it. So what do we do when these thoughts start to creep in? Because he had a whole group of people who were thinking these things. And in Hebrews 2:9, this is where it starts. It says this, "But we do see him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through suffering." Oh, man. So this is what it says, all right? So Jesus was made a little lower than the angels. That's talking about Jesus taking on human form. God came here to earth through this baby, Jesus, both God and man. He's here. The author's using a poetic term. He's like, he was made a little lower than the angels. Jesus came here. And through the suffering of death, he paid for all of our lives. And it was through suffering that Jesus was able to bring about our salvation. So the author of Hebrews finds the answer. He sets up the problem in the verses before. He finds the answer to this in Jesus' suffering. This is what he's trying to tell them. Remember, you think everything has gone wrong. Where's God at? What are all these things happening? Why is it happening to me? Remember that Jesus suffered. And in this, he wants to teach them one of the most important lessons of discipleship. And we're going to look at it as an analogy. Jesus' life is to my life as Jesus' suffering is to my suffering. This is what this means. We're more aware of the front side. As a matter of fact, on the front side of this equation, this is probably why we accepted Jesus to begin with. Jesus' life is to my life. What this means is that Jesus came here and lived a perfect life. And he lived that life not only to pay for sin and to trade his life for ours and all of those things. He lived that life also to be our example, to show us how to live. And the promise of Jesus that he even came here to the earth is that we can have his life. That if we will believe in him, that if we will have faith in him, his life that he lived, making all the decisions that we wish that we could make, that we can't do on our own, that if we will follow after Jesus, we can actually make those decisions. The life that Jesus had can be our life. That's the promise of the gospel. That's the side that on some level we're more aware of. We knew that life with Jesus would be better, and so we asked Jesus to come into our hearts, and we decided to follow after him. The second part is where he's trying to teach them. That means if Jesus' life can be our life, that also means that Jesus' suffering, what Jesus experienced in his suffering, will also be our experience in suffering. This is a hard lesson. But when you see this for the first time, you will find out that this pops up everywhere. It is all throughout Jesus' teaching in the Gospels. It's all throughout every single book that follows after that. It's everywhere, pasted everywhere. And now that you're aware of it, you'll see it everywhere. As a matter of fact, Jesus says it this way. A student cannot be above his teacher, nor a servant can be above his master. It is enough for the student to be like his teacher, and for the servant to be like his master. It's in the book of Luke. What he's doing is saying, listen, I'm here. Jesus is saying that he is the teacher. He is the master. Don't think that as the student or the servant that you're going to have it better than the teacher or the master. It will be just enough for you to be like the teacher and like the master. So in other words, what I'm experiencing now, you can bet your bottom dollar that you're going to experience the exact same thing. Peter picks up on this in the book of 1 Peter in chapter 2. They were experiencing the exact same thing. So this is what he tells them in verse 21. For you have been called for this purpose. This is your purpose. Since also Christ suffered for you, leaving you as an example for whom to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now have returned to the shepherd and the guardian of your souls. Do you see what's going on here? He says at the beginning, you've been called for this purpose, that since Christ suffered, and Christ did not suffer for a reason. In other words, he didn't do anything to bring that suffering on. He goes into great lengths to explain that. Nothing vile came from his mouth. When they were attacking him, Jesus did not attack them back. When Jesus suffered, he did not seek his own sense of vengeance that was in there. Jesus did everything right, everything perfectly. And yet the suffering still came. And Peter, in this book, is trying to show them that if Jesus experienced that and Jesus is our example, then what you're experiencing now, what you're experiencing during these times, it's the exact same thing. It's what we can expect. Everything's not always going to go perfect because we still live in a world that is not perfect. But when these things go wrong, God has a plan in the middle of it. Now, you might say, but when we look at these passages, a lot of the times we're talking about suffering for the sake of the cross. And so we're talking about people who were spreading the gospel, that were sharing the story of Jesus, and people were treating them badly because of it. People were saying bad things about them, persecuting them, all sorts of things because of that. And you are right to say so. But anything that does not line up with the garden, which is where the story began, or with heaven, where the story ends, anything that goes on in the world now that is the effect of sin, any of those things, any suffering that is caused because of that is evil. Any suffering that is brought on is not good. If it doesn't belong in the garden, or if it doesn't belong in heaven, it doesn't belong in God's story. It's not just suffering for the cross, it's suffering over flat tires. It's suffering over, I seem to be paying my bills, and I'm eating ramen noodles every single meal, and I still can't get caught up. I'm doing everything right, and it's not working out. I'm using all the principles that Jesus gave for these relationships, and these relationships are still falling apart. I'm doing everything that I should have done, and it's not turning out the way that I thought it should. It's not turning the way that I thought that this life with Jesus would turn. All of those sorts of things. That kind of suffering, everything, that's all evil, and God wants to do away with all of that in the end. Anytime you experience that, it's suffering. So what's the point then? Why does God even allow this to happen? Well, in that passage in Hebrews, it says this, "For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through suffering." This is what this means. Jesus, his sacrifice, he was perfected as a sacrifice through suffering. So in other words, Jesus did everything perfect, and the world threw everything it could possibly throw at Jesus. Every bad situation, every form of persecution, every bad thing. Jesus was tired and hungry and all of these things. Everything that works against it, all those things are not in heaven, right? You won't be hungry, you won't be tired, all suffering. The world threw everything at Jesus, and at every step along the way, Jesus took that upon himself. Chose to do what was right, but took all of that garbage to the cross and then paid for it with his perfect life. In other words, every single experience that he had that was difficult, that was hard, where sin was going on, he took that onto himself. And you know what it ended up making him? The perfect sacrifice. If Jesus was perfected through suffering, guess what? We will also be perfected through suffering. I will be perfected through suffering. That's God's plan. He won't waste what's going on. He's going to use it to make you better. This kind of works like your immune system. This is one of those areas where your physical life and your spiritual life are not very dissimilar. When a virus or a bacteria comes into your body has a system to fight against that. It surrounds and quarantines the bacteria or quarantines that virus. And then a cell comes up and it acts as the beacon to say, hey, wait a minute, we've got a quarantined area. And then it finds a friend who comes in and kills whatever that invading thing is. Not only that, but afterwards, your body remembers what attacked it. So that anytime you're attacked by the same thing again, it knows exactly what to do, and what once made you sick is now no longer able to make you sick. Your spiritual life is the exact same way. When these moments, when these things, when that suffering comes up, when things are falling apart in front of you, God intends to use that to make you stronger. God intends to use that to teach you things that you didn't know and that you wouldn't know unless you had to go through this trial or through this experience. God intends to use that thing that pops up within your life to help you to lay aside old habits that He's been trying to get you to lay aside. God's going to use that experience maybe even to have you accept new habits and adopt new habits in your life that you once didn't have before, that He's been trying to build up within you. God wants to use that experience so that you will be victorious through it, and that once you have overcome this trial, you will have the memory of that trial, and what once was able to make you spiritually sick will not be able to make you spiritually sick anymore. That's what growth is all about. That's what perfection is all about. God is going to be perfecting us along the way, chipping away the things that He doesn't want and building up the things that He does want in our life. And He uses those moments of suffering in order to do that. What this will require is a shift in thinking. Our first thoughts will still happen. There is no way on this side of eternity that when everything falls apart, you're not going to think about saying a word you didn't want to say, or thinking a thought you didn't want to think, or even in the end, going, God, what in the world are you up to? For some reason, I'm doubting your ability to do this. But through the grace of God, after we think that first thought, we can actually experience a shift in thinking. We can begin to ask ourselves a very important question. God, all right, I know that you're smart enough. I know that you're powerful enough. I know that you care. But God, what are you trying to grow in me? What are you trying to do here? God, instead of letting this overwhelm me, instead of letting this overcome me, I'm going to turn to you and I'm going to say, God, there's obviously something that you're teaching me. There's obviously something that you want me to know. God, is there a habit that you would like for me to set aside now? I'm willing to do it. The situation stinks so bad that if this is the way to get out of it, you know what, God? I'll set that thing to the side. God, is there something that you're wanting to build up in me? Is there a new habit that I've either forgotten or got away from or need to try for the first time? Is there something new I need to bring into my life, God? I'm all ears. Show me what that is, God. And what we'll find is that we will begin to become victorious in those areas. But this will require a tremendous amount of faith and hope in God. It will require a tremendous amount. When everything's falling apart, everything in us wants to ask the same questions we've always asked and just leave it there. It's going to take something new and different, faith and hope, in order to build us in the opposite direction. I'll be honest, it requires more than I have. I can tell you, I don't have enough faith to do it. I don't have enough faith in the middle of those situations to choose to ask those questions. I don't even have enough faith to turn to God. Left to myself, I would have never, ever, ever turned to God. I would always seek my own control and my own greatest pleasure. But luckily for me, faith doesn't come from me. Faith is something that God gives because of what He has done. We don't have enough to have the faith that we need. So here's what God says. I will give you the faith that you need to overcome any situation that you could possibly go through. In case you're doubting that, Romans 12:3 is the one that says, to each and every person, God gives a measure of faith. That doesn't mean that some get this much, some get a larger amount. Everybody gets the same amount. What that means is you have the portion that you need to be successful in this life, and God has given it to you. This is a new reality. As a matter of fact, the disciples didn't have that right. And in the book of Luke, they cry out to Jesus, Lord, increase our faith. That seems like a good statement, right? You know, Jesus in a tongue-in-cheek way looks at him and is like, listen, guys, if you had the faith the size of a mustard seed, you would command to this tree to get up and be planted in the ocean, and it would do it. It's like some kind of Fantasia and Lord of the Rings hybrid where this tree just gets up and dances over and plants itself in the sea. It's tongue-in-cheek because Jesus is telling them if you had the faith to do it, but he has given them the faith to do it. So in other words, the problem isn't that they don't have the faith, the problem is that they won't grab what they already got. And what that means for us is that in any situation that you experience, no matter what this world throws at you, no matter what bad things come, and no matter how quickly those bad things come or how many things that happen, nothing in this world can overcome your faith. Because it's not dependent on us. It's dependent on God, and God has given us everything that we need. You always have the faith that you need. We also have hope in what God has done and will do. And guys, in the American language, we use the word hope wrong. We say things like, I hope that I'll find $1 million on the side of the road one day. Man, I hope I just open up that brown bag and I'm like, hot dog, $1 million. Or I hope one day I'll take the dream vacation, or I hope one day I'll drive that really expensive car, or whatever it is. Really, we're just saying, I wish, right? Man, I wish I could find that money. I wish I could drive that car, whatever it is. Hope comes from knowledge and from the assurance of the future. Hope comes because God has told us we can know how the story ends. Hope comes because we know for a fact that in the end, Jesus is going to do away with all sin. And even though right now we do not see everything under his subjugation, not everything seems to be under his reign. In fact, it is. And when Jesus comes back and ushers in heaven, there will be no more suffering. There will be no more pain. That all the effects from the fall, the curse that came when God told them that the ground would now be hard, that it would be hard to labor in this world. That experience that we have that asks that question, why is it so hard? Jesus will do away with that, and it will be back the way it was intended. We don't have hope because we wish that God would do all that. We have hope because we know for a fact that when he comes back, he's absolutely going to do it. And you can take that to the bank. And that means that there is nothing in this world that Jesus has not defeated. And so there is nothing again in this world that can defeat you. It can be hard. It can be difficult. Your feelings, your emotions will fail you and tell you that you have been overwhelmed and tell you that you have been overcome. But the reality of the faith and hope that God has given us is that it is always enough and that he will always see you through and that your story will not end until God says it's time for you to be home with him. And as a matter of fact, Philippians 1:21 says this, to live is Christ and to die is gain. And in this circumstance, think about this. Say, what's the worst thing could happen to you? Well, I could die. To live is Christ, suffering, difficult. To die, so the worst thing that this world can throw at you is I get to be home with Jesus? All right. I'll see you suckers later. That's the way this works. Nothing this world can throw at you will conquer you. You will overcome it all. And the worst thing this world has is the best thing that will ever happen to you. You'll be home with the Lord. Nothing. And here's the thing. Here's what I want you to take home from this. You may be experiencing this now. You may be going through a period of time where things are just hard. It just seems to be falling apart. You may be going through a period of time like I do, where there's like a million things going wrong, even at once. It may seem like it's overwhelming. Your next season of that may be next week. It may be next month. It's coming, okay? It always happens. It happens to all of us. Whatever that looks like, here's what I want to tell you. Don't you dare give up. Don't you dare quit. Not for 1 second. Do not grow weary. Fight on. Persevere. Take confidence in the fact that you have the faith and you have the hope that you need to see you through, and that on the other side of this, God is going to make you stronger than you ever were. Because no matter what the situation is, no matter what the suffering is, no matter what life throws at you, God will always use it to your benefit. And it can never, ever overcome you. As a matter of fact, Galatians 6:9 says this, "So let's not allow ourselves to get fatigued doing good. At the right time, we will harvest a good crop. If we don't give up or quit." Don't you dare give up. Don't you dare quit. You have what it takes to make it, and you will be stronger for it. Not because it depends on us, because it would fail on us, but because it depends on Jesus, and he has done everything that he needed to do to make us successful.